Hello, everybody, and welcome back for yet another episode of Upon Further Review. I am Troy here with Mike, and today we are going to discuss the conviction of Derek Chauvin. We're going to discuss police misconduct and police accountability, and we're going to discuss what it is we actually want moving forward to reform this system and make it better for every citizen, especially those of color, and to increase accountability and trust in policing yet again. And before I get started, one thing I openly embrace is, the mental health aspect of this. It is punishing to constantly watch these videos of black bodies being killed, murdered, laying in the street, while some officer stands over them, while people cry and scream. To watch these videos of abuse that often turn to murder, like what we saw with the George Floyd murder, we can now say, because he has been convicted, where people are begging officers to do something, begging them to get off of his neck, begging them to allow this man to breathe for nearly 10 minutes, we now know, after the aftermath of the trial. Young kids testified in this. There were children present. It's punishing. Derek Chauvin was convicted of all three counts. He faces 40 years in prison for the second-degree murder charge alone, 25 years for the third-degree murder, and 10 years for the manslaughter. A combination of 75 years in prison. And you know what's sad about this, Mike, is there's still a level of holding our breath here, because we need to make sure that there's an appropriate sentence rendered down. If anything, he should be held to a higher standard because he's a police officer, because he was entrusted with power and the trust of the people. And he abused that power and he killed someone in the process. 75 years in prison. I tell you what, anything less than 20 would be an outrage, and it should be closer to the higher end of that. We take a look just on the same day as that conviction, and we see yet another black body killed in Makia Bryant, 16 years old. That case is a touch different because it seems to have split a lot of people. But one thing is for certain, people are tired of seeing the police kill people, Mike. It seems that no matter where you turn, you will find killings that some try to justify. And there seems to be this tug of war of what we actually want out of law enforcement. This tug of war of what do we want the police to do and to be. In other countries, most police officers don't even carry guns. Yet here, every slight, every piece of disrespect is met with a drawn pistol. I don't know about you, Mike. I've had a police officer draw a pistol twice in my life, and I was so young. That was so many years ago that I'm lucky. That I would be a lot more terrified now, having seen such a high profile thing. And the reality is, for those who seem to think that this is some sort of coordinated effort, that is just the media, you know, trying to whip people into a frenzy. The difference is today that didn't exist when I had those pistols drawn. Everyone has a high definition, often 4K camera in their pocket. Everyone has the ability to record and therefore create a visual record, undeniable. Who are you going to believe? The words of a police officer or your lying eyes? Because can you fathom if that little girl did not record the murder of George Floyd, Mike? Like, what if you look at the police report? They said he had a medical incident, right? They tried to blame his own death on him, when it's clear that they strangled this man to death. It's clear that they compressed his neck, limiting the flow of oxygen. They brought in experts who walked through every agonizing step that resulted in its death. And the sad part is there isn't always video even today. But we get to see more cases and more incidents, and therefore it's drawn the scrutiny of the people, as it should. A lot of people seem to forget that the police work for the people. They answer to us, and we decide what their tactics will be, how they operate, what it will look like, and what accountability will look like. And they're fighting it. They're fighting it tooth and nail. But we're finally, it appears, seem to be right on the edge of actually making real change in the situation. And it's still an exhausting fight ahead of us. I don't have all the answers, that's for darn sure. But one thing is for certain, something has to give and something needs to change. And we have to begin making those steps. And the first one is understanding that we decide that as a people. The voters decide that, our elected officials decide that, and we need to hold them all accountable because the police wield great power. And as we get into later on down the line today, Mike, it can be abused very easily.
So I think Chris Como from CNN said it best when he said that you won't see a real change happen until these police officers are killing white children from good neighborhoods. And I say good neighborhoods with my hands in quotes in the air. To be honest, the only catalyst for real change that hasn't happened is white children having been disproportionately killed at the hands of police officers. And that's a sad thing to have to say out loud, but it's true. If police officers were killing white children and white men at the rate they kill black children and black men, then we wouldn't be having this conversation because there have been laws passed yesterday to prevent these atrocious crimes. But somehow, some way, and hate to say it, it's usually from the far right, when a black person gets killed by law enforcement, the first thing they want to say is, what was that person doing? Why wasn't that person complying? Why were they doing this? Why weren't they doing that? Even though we see video evidence upon video evidence of white people doing the same, if not worse things in the presence of police officers, and them using all the restraint in the world, not instead of pulling out their weapon and using lethal force to neutralize the situation. It makes no sense. People they try their hardest, some folks, to say it's not a race thing. Well, it's clearly a race thing. It's happening to black and brown individuals at a disproportionate rate than it's happening to anybody else. And there's no getting around those facts. Even the facts that if a black or brown individual is sentenced in jail, they get harsher and longer sentences than their white counterparts. It's a dual justice system, a justice system for white people and a justice system for everybody else. And until that's addressed, not much is going to change. You would think that common sense police law, how police govern, you would think there would be a national database that if you got fired from one force for conduct unbecoming of a police officer, that you shouldn't be able to just go somewhere else and get hired. You think there would be a national database to track that? No. And what do we find? Police unions fighting at every corner to prevent something like that from happening. You think it would be a common sense thing to say, hey, if you're a police officer and you pull up to the scene and you see another one of your police officers doing the wrong thing, putting someone else's life, putting the public's life in danger, you think that police officer will have a duty to intervene. You think it would be his obligation to stop his fellow officer from terrorizing and committing a crime on his own sake. But no, that's not a law. You would think that that's something that if there were so many quote unquote good apples and just a few rotten apples in the police force, that there would be an overwhelming support for it. Yet we see that fault at every corner and every turn. You would think that qualified immunity, where it makes it almost impossible to sue a police officer for misconduct, you think that wouldn't be a thing if there's so many of these good apples going about. You would think that if there's clear-cut proof and evidence that an officer has done wrong to a citizen of this country, that they could try to recapture some kind of get some kind of amends, try to recapture some kind of their damages in a financial capacity. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, that's all you have to go for. You can't go back and take whatever that officer did back. So you try to recompensate that person. It makes it almost damn near impossible to do it. You would think these things would be common sense. You would think these things that everybody would agree upon, because you would say, well, these things, these things shouldn't happen to anybody. But only because it's happening to people of black and brown color is fought at every turn by certain segments of the population. And I don't know what the answer is. I was talking to somebody and I said, they say, well, what do you think the answer is? And I said, you can't legislate hate out of somebody, right? You can't just take all these police officers who are resistant to change, who judge before, they get all the facts, who get a sense of entitlement from the power of carrying a firearm and knowing that they have the power to, dispense life and death, with the trigger finger. I don't know how you legislate that out, right? You can make it harder for these people to get in there, but I don't think you can just legislate out hate in people. You can try, but what you can do, you're not going to prevent 100% of the cases, but you can prevent a lot of them if you put these rules and safeguards in place that make it harder for these people to get onto the force. And then if they're on the force and they do step out of line, make the punishment severe enough as an example to other officers that they should not do that, right? When they know that they can get a slap on the wrist, worst case, maybe get fired and just go down the street and join another district, they can get a job somewhere else. What's the incentive for them to stop? What is it? Something has to change, but my fear is that change is not going to happen until police brutality is felt by all. You even have, when we have it on video, like you said, 4K, high definition, we're getting 60 frames per second of brutality being caught, and yet somehow, some way, you having people trying to say, well, if so-and-so had just complied, or if so-and-so had done this, or so-so, they said he had drugs. It doesn't matter. Most of these crimes that they're alleged, and I quote alleged because you can't even charge them because they're dead. But these people are alleged of committing are nonviolent, petty crimes. If they're actually guilty of those crimes, it doesn't result. It doesn't warrant a sentence of death to be handed out on the spot. And it's frustrating to see. I really wish there could be some sweeping reform and changes, but I'm not holding my breath. This has been a issue, for centuries for African Americans in this country, and I can't see that going away without a strong fight from the far right.
There's always going to be those who are seeking to stand in the way of progress, but we cannot be deterred by them. It's not going to be easy. You're absolutely right. But we saw the movement that kicked off last year with this murder of George Floyd. He became an international symbol of unjust killings by government. And I think a lot of people kind of miss that the police are the armed enforcement division of government. This is the government assaulting, abusing, and killing people. And that's not to say every police officer is bad or anything like that. We don't need or we want to abolish police. But the reality is, one bad apple spoils the bunch. That is the phrase. That is the colloquialism used. The good cops need to begin calling out and holding accountable their peers. You talked about, accountability and misconduct. You can't pick a city, a county, a police department that does not have misconduct that's out and open. We have officers out in the streets that are able to determine this and determine that and use their training to, I get this smell and I have probable cause and all this suspicion directed at the general public, but they seem to miss their officer breaking the law right next to them. There's a case in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, Mike, right outside our home. And I always tell people, go drive in the wrong, area too far from DC and see what you encounter. And the number one on my list for me personally is Fairfax County. Driving out there, getting pulled over for the hell of it. There's an officer named Jonathan Frytag who has been accused of stealing drugs from the police property room to plant on innocent people that he stopped without legal basis. Court filings show. The Washington Post did an article released on April 16th of 2021 chronicling this, and they've been investigating him for years. You mentioned leaving one police department heading to another. What's crazy is Fairfax police said they began investigating Officer Frytag after receiving a tip about him in July of 2019, a tip. And what's sad is we will never know where the origin of that tip is. It took that long. This officer is 25 years old, Mike, at the time. I mean, barely been an officer for 4 years. 400 convictions now must be thrown out based on testimonial work of him. You know what he did? He resigned in May of 2020 after they began investigating him in 2019. So July 2019, May of the next year, he resigns after the FBI joined the criminal investigation of him. So the FBI is investigating him and his former job is investigating him. He resigns. The Washington Post published the allegations in June of 2020. He was hired by the Brevard County Sheriff's Office in Florida in August of 2020, Mike. This dude resigned in May and had a job by August. That's not even a full 3 months, barely. We don't know the exact dates. And this is someone who is underneath investigation by the FBI. That's how easy it is for a cop to evade accountability for their actions. This guy, and hats off to the Washington Post on this one because they didn't push the issue. This guy would probably just be working down in Florida and nobody would know. The Fairfax County Human Resources Department reported to Brevard that the former officer had never been subject to disciplinary action and that there are no disciplinary records in his file, even though they claim to have been investigating him. He was that once the Brevard County found out, hats off to them, they fired him on April 1st. But that's only after the Post inquired about his status there. He was fired April 1st of 2021. And this guy was able to shift and get his powers, his badge, his gun back, and go out there, most likely continue harassing people. The Brevard County Sheriff, Wayne Ivey, sent a scathing 2-page letter to the interim Fairfax police chief, accusing him of providing misleading representations. But this happens all the time. Officers will commit heinous misconduct. Nothing gets marked in their record. There's no national database, and they're able to move. And if depending on where you live, like we're here in North Texas, Mike, if you could be a bad Dallas police officer and you can slide right over to any other police department, nobody will know. You can pick any county, any city, and just continue being a police officer somewhere. It's easy, especially if you have former experience. They'll hire you in a second. Where's the accountability in that? There was another huge case back in 2016. Baltimore police had a gun task force that was accused, and this is still being worked through, of all sorts of false allegations, robbing people, planting guns and drugs. And when we say accused, a former officer's testifying about this, by the way, that they had robbed people that have been accused of no crimes using false evidence to squeeze them into being quote unquote let go for crimes they never commit and crimes that didn't exist if they were able to take their money or property. That they were out keeping toy guns to plant on people in case there was a shootout or an accident or anything, keeping drugs to plant on people. If you turn over any police department, you'll find allegations like this. And oftentimes, police are able to just simply move over and evade the accountability for their actions. There must be some sort of national database to keep track of these things. You cannot let people commit crimes like this. By the way, these are crimes. This isn't just, you say misconduct. This isn't, being late to work here. This is people's lives. That officer Frytag in Fairfax County, his testimony convicted a former DC firefighter who actually, before I say convicted, to be clarified, he took a plea deal because he was, despite being innocent, Mike, and this happens too much in our legal system, despite being innocent, he has a law enforcement officer saying he found this gun and these drugs, and you're facing 30 years. But if you take this plea deal, we'll give you 5. That's a punishing prospect to take to court. Your word against an officer standing there in that uniform will walk in there and lie. And these lies can be small. They can be, they were coming towards me and that's why I took this action. They were doing this, they had that. Or they can be huge, like I literally brought the drugs and guns myself and planted them on this guy and claimed that he had them. He reeked of marijuana. Here's the huge bag, or whatever it is. We authorize a search because words were slurred and what have you. Whatever excuse they wish to make, no one wields more power in our society than the law enforcement officer. They must be held accountable and they must be made examples of when they break it, because that's the only way to restore the trust of people. Knowing that they too will follow the law. And if they don't, they will be punished and they will be turned in by their fellow officers. One of the big things that resulted in this conviction of Derek Chauvin was not just the police chief, because the officers expect that. They expect, that's the head, that's the top, that's management. They expect him to come and testify, or her, whoever the police chief may be. But to have fellow officers come out and testify, and I hope they keep that same energy, by the way, because one of the big things we need for reform, some states are working on it, is a duty to intervene. Derek Chauvin's knee was on the neck, But there were 3 to 4 other officers standing around, Mike, just watching this happen. There were 3 other officers on the body of George Floyd. They had full control of him, and they still watched one of their peers strangle this man to death. And they stood there just as nonchalantly. No one's saying calm down. No one's telling them to take it easy. But I tell you what, you put all of these officers, because these other officers are now accomplice to a murder, because Derek Chauvin has been convicted. And you talked about it earlier. If they commit violence against a citizen, they'll try to say what you were doing is wrong. And then if it's provable, a fact that you weren't doing anything wrong at the time, they will drag up your past. They will tell you you got convicted years ago. They will tell you you're a drug addict, you're this, that, and the third. They will defame your character. But do you know, Mike, that in this trial of Derek Chauvin, they were not allowed to use any of his history of misconduct. This guy had like over 25 complaints. They weren't allowed to bring any of that up. They weren't allowed to defame his character, and he was still convicted. If it was the other way around, they were allowed to drag George Floyd's name through the mud, to bring up situations in this past that had nothing to do with the fact that they encountered a man allegedly for a counterfeit bill. And you know what, Mike? I thought when it came to that, we still will never know where that alleged counterfeit $20 bill is. And I thought they rejected him when he tried to pay, and then the police met him outside. No, he actually paid. Mike, he had change in his pocket from that transaction. Can you imagine how confused you are when you walk outside and encounter police? And police behave as if the bare questioning of them, any question of what's going on, any clarification, anything is an insult to them, where their spite and their wrath is taken out on you. That's why Derek Chauvin had his knee on his neck. It was spite. It was wrath. It was to punish. And if you do things like that, you have to be held accountable for it. You have too much power as a police officer to be able to get away with that. And by the way, disrespect of a police officer is not a crime. The professional is you. You're the one who's trained. You see the meme all the time. The citizens are expected to remain calm while officer screams obscenities in their face with a gun aimed at their heads. Meanwhile, they get to react out of fear, out of ignorance. They get to react because they're disrespected, and their fellow officers will do nothing about it while it happens right in front of them. That's what has to change. It must be structural. Structural change is needed to get things moving. Structural change. Number 1, hold them accountable. Number 2, keep a national database so they can't just resign before any charges or any allegations are put into their record. And that needs to follow them everywhere they go. Misconduct needs to lead to never being allowed to work, not even as a security guard, let alone as a police officer again. Start coming after their pockets for these misconducts. The states and the counties and the cities pay billions upon billions upon billions of dollars when it comes to police misconduct. The cost of police misconduct is shrugged off far too often. You have cities like Chicago that have paid over $500 million for misconduct over a decade. And that's just considered to be the cost of doing business. If we were to spend this money on school kids, pre-K, spend this money on, stimulus checks, people are up in arms, screaming about the money being spent. And these are cities spending that kind of money, not states, not the federal government. There's a high cost to police misconduct. There's a cost to the taxpayer. That's everyone involved in the country, every citizen. There's a cost to the lives destroyed. That police officer who framed people, there's nothing he can do and no sentence he can serve that'll give that firefighter his job back or any of the other, or his life back, destroyed. Any of the other 400 people falsely convicted. And that's whether it's Fairfax County, Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, LA, Oakland, New York. You can't find a state, city, or county where officers haven't framed people just to solve crimes, while prosecutors look the other way, while the so-called good cops stand idly by and watch their partners abuse people. There wasn't a good cop in the video of the George Floyd murder because they all stood by and watched it happen and they didn't care, completely unbothered, with no threat to their own livelihoods, their own jobs, their own pockets, nothing. Never in a million years think to go to jail. The look Derek Chauvin held in his face as they read guilty was one of confusion. What do you mean I'm guilty? I'm a police officer. white one at that, because Minnesota had no problem convicting the black Muslim officer who killed the white woman inexplicably, as he should have been convicted, by the way. That's not to say it shouldn't have happened. But oftentimes, when we find these white police officers killing citizens, because black people are disproportionately targeted, Mike, but the reality is they're killing everybody. They're killing white people too. It's not at the disproportionate rate, simply because when police officers go to figure out who to frame, they don't go to Beverly Hills, Mike. They don't go to the rich side of town. They don't go mess with people who have power, money, and influence to fight them and prove them wrong. They go to the poor side of town where they know they have nothing but public defenders offering them plea deals. They can't afford the lawyers to fight. They can't afford the investigations, the review of evidence and things of that nature. And that's what creates the structural systemic racism. You have police officers out here pretending that they do not have quotas to fill. When they do, officers will be fired if they're not coming up with citations, convictions, and arrests. You can't have an officer just going about a year. Yeah, I haven't arrested anybody, haven't written a ticket anywhere. You're going to be fired, Mike. And if you keep pushing them to find convictions and find arrests and find citations, at some point you're giving them a financial incentive to do so because they want to keep their job, and therefore they're going to make it up. Because that's the state of law enforcement in the country. Every law enforcement, so all of them will say, no, we don't have quotas and things of that nature, but the evidence is in the contrary of that. And there are cases you can find, even here in Dallas, of people getting fired for not writing enough tickets, for not coming up with enough arrests. Therefore, they go hunting for them. They go looking for them. And where do they look? It's never going to be on the rich side of town.
If me, you, and a bunch of folks go riding around in a minivan, and one guy in the minivan inexplicably pulls out a gun and shoots somebody, we all go to jail for murder. Right? You know, that has been proven time and time again. Just being there at the scene with the offender gives you the same punishment. Why is that not the case for police? To me, if you were there, same rules should apply. If you were there, like I said, he's convicted of murder, then they're all murderers, because that means they were there participating in the scene, you know. And we've seen Black people been arrested and convicted for this charge many a times. I don't think there should be a difference on how we're treated. Like you said, because they have the badge, they should be held to a higher standard. So you would think that their punishment would be more severe because they knew that they shouldn't be doing that. They have the authority and the training to make sure something like that does not happen, yet they let it happen time and time again. I think there needs to be, honestly, I think I've been saying this for a while. It needs to be a federal, this needs to be a federal issue. Obviously, we see it to the point that these independent police jurisdictions and precincts cannot police themselves. The police obviously cannot police themselves. So you need an independent body to come in and investigate all claims of police misconduct. And anytime there's a police shooting involved, it needs to be an independent, and when I mean independent, even independent of the state, an independent federal body come in, maybe make it the FBI, maybe create a new agency just for it. But someone needs to come in that's objective, that's not by anything that's going on within those walls of that police precinct, to come in and figure out and get to the bottom of it, not looking out for so-and-so, you know, not helping out my buddy because he's a officer just like me. Many independent investigations, independent charging, independent any kind of punishment that gets handed down. It should not, at this point, it cannot be left up to local jurisdiction, because they've shown and they've proven time that this is something they're not capable of addressing. Either they're not willing or they're incapable of doing it. Doesn't matter. There needs to be a federal presence, a federal government body, organization, department that comes in and addresses these matters, because we can't no longer wait for some states to get it together. Because what happens if you let this state do it versus this state, this city versus this city and this state, then it's all over the place. And there's never going to be a uniform sense of justice to feel like that the population has a good sense that policing is under control. And that's sad that you got to say, we need police to police the police, right? This is sad that you have to get to that because we can't fix it, within your given jurisdiction, that you need somebody to come in and intervene to make sure that this happens. Look, the government's not perfect. The federal government is not perfect. But at this point, to me, emergency measures need to take place to prevent further loss of life. And not even just loss of life. Like you mentioned with Derek Chauvin, he was accused, and now they're getting ready to investigate and possibly charge him on. He had a similar incident with a teenager, a black teen, where he busted him upside the head so hard that the teen required stitches after he was already subdued, and had his knee on the teen's back. And the teen was, of course, saying he couldn't breathe. And he had the knee on the teen's back for 14 minutes. 14 minutes. This is a pattern of behavior, right? This is something, and best believe that the officers of that scene obviously didn't move him off him either. So that means they were fine with it. They were fine with the way they were treating this individual, right? This shows that it's a mentality thing. It's a mentality thing for these police departments. They can say all they want to the blue in the face. There's just a couple of rotten apples, like you said, a few rotten apples spoiled a bunch, where I don't think it's a couple of rotten apples anymore. I think you have a handful of apples, then you have a handful of bad apples, and you have a big barrel of indifferent apples who don't care what happens. They're just saying, as long as I get my paycheck, hey, I ain't trying to stir the pot too much. Hey, I'm looking at retirement in 10 years. Man, I'm just trying to get promoted. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. All these self-serving things that is going through their heads while that's preventing them from taking action to protect a citizen of this country. I don't think, that we can leave it up to them to fix it for themselves. They can't do it, right? You're going to need an independent federal body to come in and regulate policing in this country. It's to that point. And like you said, police here are more heavily armed than they've ever been. I don't think with the culture of guns in America that's going to change. I know there is a push to make some kind of legislation changes to make it harder to get, background checks a little bit more stringent and, prevent certain guns from being put in circulation. But to be honest, guns are a part of the fabric of this country. It's always has been. And I find that even harder. I find it harder for them to actually take the guns out of people's hands than it is to fix policing. So in the meanwhile, while that issue has to get itself sorted out, I think they really need to take a federal stance on how we're going to tackle the issue of police misconduct in this country, because we can't allow this to go on. How many times are we going to see that even in the case, I give you the recent case we had where the police officer shot the girl, 16 years old, did she have a knife and was she lunging at an individual? Yes. So in an empirical sense, if you want to go by saying, he was justified, then yes, you can make that argument. And yes, he probably will not be found. They probably won't even charge him. And he'll probably keep his job because at the end of the day, there was an individual with a knife lunging at another individual. And, the intent looked like, if you just put it to the scene, that she was trying to stab her, right? But I will argue this. Why is that the first thing to do, is to pull out your most lethal form your most lethal form to address the situation? Why can't you pull out a taser or pepper spray? Why can't you try to talk down more before you actually fire the trigger? I mean, there's a lot of things that could have been done that weren't done. And these things, I don't think, are readily taught. I don't think they're taught good de-escalation techniques, because if they are, they're ignoring it, because the first thing is always the most harsh and lethal thing that they seem to do, is they seem to pull out, the most lethal weapon and aim it at somebody. Like you mentioned before, Troy, it's like, how are we supposed to have respect for police officers? And when they pull up to you, guns on the trigger, finger on the trigger, yelling obscenities at you, and they're talking about, you need to respect me. Like, how am I supposed to respect you? You shouldn't respect in return, right? And also, police officers need to know and understand the climate of the country, because they know that Black people are afraid of police officers. We're afraid. If I got pulled over, the first thing in my mind is, let me do everything that I can do to make sure that I make it out of the situation alive. That doesn't go through a white person's mind. That goes through every Black person's mind. how can let me make sure I can do what I can do to make sure I can get out of the situation alive. You know, and then when you come over and get pulled over, I saw an incident where a guy got pulled over, he recorded it, and the police pulled him over for going 60, I think it was going 65 in the 70. Whatever it was
He's
5 miles
5 miles
under the speed
under.
limit.
5 miles under
And,
speed limit.
and he's asking, why did you pull me over? And the cop couldn't give him a reason other than that. Just because he wanted to look at him, wanted to run his place, wanted to look inside his car. I mean, how much are we going to get away with that? To me, if you pull somebody over, if I find out that you pull somebody over for doing 5 miles under the speed limit for no apparent cause, just because you saw a black person driving, you're done. Hand me your badge and your gun. You're done. You're out of here. But yet that guy's going to continue to go serve in the police force and pull other black people over for fraudulent charges. You know, like you said, trying to make quotas, trying to figure out, trying to invent a crime to stop one. You know, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. That's why I'm now under the opinion that, you know, policing can't be handled at the local jurisdiction level. It has to be handled at a federal level because, you know, there is no real accountability. There seems to only be accountability when there's an investigation, like you said, with a Washington Post piece, or an outrage or outcry when somebody catches on video and it gets attention from social justice. You know, outside of that, they're happy to sweep this stuff under the rug. How many cases of police misconduct do you think goes on a daily basis in this country? Far too many to count. These are all the things that happen that never gets any kind of publicity, doesn't get recorded on camera. No, you get swept under the rug in the department. How many times has this happened? It's been happening for decades. And now, just because we're getting a few of these incidents on camera, now people are starting to realize, like, oh man, maybe black people, they weren't making this stuff up after all. We've been living this nightmare, you know, since before Jim Crow, since back to the times where, you know, they had slave catchers, you know, working on the plantations to make, you know, you had people making sure you kept the slaves in line. You know, a lot of policing traces their lineage back to that. So it's been ingrained in the police departments that the subjugation of black people is a requirement for them. You know, a lot of times you have police officers that are not from the community. They didn't grow up there. They're coming from somewhere else. They don't understand the mistrust of police and community, and it's all because of good reason. And they don't know how to talk or communicate with the people there. You know, me and my wife, we like to watch the First 48. And one thing I do notice in that, and I like it because it's more on the detective side of, you know, solving crimes, you know. But one thing I noticed that seems that there's certain police officers, a very, very small few of them that are actually from that community, can engage and get information and get trust from that community when they're trying to solve these murders. People trust them. When he says, look, man, I ain't trying to hem you up. I'm just trying to figure out what happened to X, Y, and Z. You know, they can understand where they come from. He can communicate to them on a different level than a white guy that grew up in suburbia that has no clue what goes on in that neighborhood, because he's been in that neighborhood. He understands the issues and the problems of it. And they trust him and know it's like, if he says this, and we know he's going to be that, right? Even when they, you know, finally arrest and catch the individual and they have a, you know, have a ceremony or have some kind of celebration of life for that individual, they usually even invite that officer because he's part of the community. That's his home, right? He knows the people there. He has a personal connection, right? It's too far and too few between where we actually have police officers from the communities represented that patrol there. You know, how much different would these interactions be if a police officer who's from that community rolls up to the scene and says, oh, that's so-and-so. Yeah, he has, I know, because I know him, I know his family, that individual has mental issues, right? So let me make sure, I know this is not just a violent individual lashing out. I know this guy is in crisis. Let me do everything I can in my power to make sure that, you know, this whole situation resolves peacefully. But, you know, we don't get that. We get a white person pull up to, you know, white officer pull up to the scene, you know, guns blazing, you know, shoot first, ask question later, barking, demanding arguments, escalating instead of de-escalating the scene, and making things worse for everybody. Stuff has to change. I mean, I don't know how long we're going to sing the same old song of police reform like I said, I'm still, I like that there's more attention to and to the cause. Recently, thanks to in part the video of George Floyd and how, I mean, there's really no denying that, right? There's no denying how ridiculous and ludicrous and obscene that was for someone to slowly take the life out of a man in front of the world to see. There's no denying that, right? So I'm happy that, I'm not happy for that what happened to George Floyd, but I'm happy that that was actually caught on video so the world could see that this is an issue, and this happens far too often in this country, and only happens to a certain segment of the population, and that it needs to be addressed. So I'm hopeful in the sense that it's getting a lot more play, but at the same time, history has dictated that there really hasn't been that much of meaningful changes to policing. So I am cautious in what we see getting done. We see that qualified immunity. We see that police be able to go to, you get fired from one jurisdiction, you go down and join another. We see that a duty to intervene is being fought tooth and nail by police unions and the far right everywhere you go. Talking about blue lives matter. Blue lives don't matter. You know why blue lives don't matter? Because blue lives is not a thing. You're not born a police officer. You don't come out the womb and say, "Yup, he's a police officer." That's a profession. You choose to be that. You wake up every day and say, "I am willing to do that," because you know what? You could quit at any time. Anytime. You're choosing that as a profession to do. We acknowledge that it's a hard profession. We acknowledge that at times you have to put your life on the line, but it is a profession of your choosing. You weren't drafted into the police, into being the police officer. There's no such thing as a blue life. That's a profession. It's something you try. That's something that you chose to do. You sought after. So when people say all these blue lives matter, it really gets under my skin because, I didn't have a choice to be born black. I was born black in a country that marginalizes people of my skin tone. I didn't have a choice in that matter. That's the way that I came out, But you have a choice in matter you're going to be a police officer, and also you have a choice in matter what kind of police officer you're going to be. You're going to be a part of the problem, part of the solution. Too often we see people either being part of the problem or being fine with the problem happening as long as they're not doing it, which is about the same to me, right? So we have to figure out as a country how we're going to address this. My vote is to handle this at a federal matter. I'm tired of seeing this get investigations and things getting botched at the local level. I want federal action at this point.
One thing I want to leave people with as we wrap up here is the problem is structural. Oftentimes in Baltimore, over half the police force is black, and even the people who are doing the framing are black. Just because you have a black cop, in fact, I don't know about you, I've had experiences that were actually worse with black cops because they feel as though they're going to go and target. They feel as though they're going to go, and also they're held up to the same standards where they have to go and find the citations. They got to find the arrests. They got to find the convictions. It's a structural problem, and that's almost a topic for another day. That's what structural racism is. It's not just white cops killing black people. It's cops, period, killing citizens. When we talk about targeting, Philando Castile back in 2016, we all know the name and heard the story. That's the man who was shot, who had a concealed carry license. And an officer shows up and, he tells him, he identifies him. Which, by the way, police officer, here's my ID, here's who I am. What makes you think that I'm going to pull on you? And if you are threatened, why not back up? Take a few steps back, retreat. They're always driving forward and always escalating to the maximum level of violence. Always. Philando Castile was pulled over 49 times in 13 years, Mike. 49 times. Often with his firearm on him. Never having an issue. Never having a problem. The problem is, why was he pulled over 49 times? He was literally pulled. He kept getting harassed by police until he was killed by them. And unfortunately, that's the reality in a lot of places. For poor Makia Bryant, no, there's not going to be any charges. There's not going to be any arrests or anything like that. But the reality is, everyone who's ever been a teacher, especially in underserved communities, poor areas, you've broken up a fight where someone had scissors, where someone oftentimes had a knife, somebody was behaving violently. That's happened by club bouncers. That's happened by teachers. That's happened by many people without ever having to draw a gun and fire within seconds. We demand better as people. Over in Japan, you know what they do when somebody's being violent, being outrageous? Mind you, many of them don't have guns on them. They literally wrap people up in futons. They'll wrap you up in a mat, might carry you back until you calm down. That's what they're doing in other countries. And before we even get into the real numbers of the danger of police officers, being a police officer is not even not even top 10 dangerous jobs in America. Number one will be logging. 2, fishing and fishing-related workers. Aircraft pilots is 3. Roofers is 4. Refuse and recyclable material collectors. Structural iron and steel workers. Truck drivers. Farmers, ranchers, and agriculturals. First line supervisors, construction trades, extraction workers. Miscellaneous agricultural workers. That's your top 10. You got grounds maintenance. First line supervisors, mechanics, installers, repairers. Construction laborers. And then police and sheriff patrol officers. Just ahead of electrical power line installers and repairers. It has never been safer in history, is my point, of being a police officer. Yet they're reacting with violence and they're killing more people than ever before. Crime is at, decade lows, Mike. If you go, and I'll never make light of the loss of a police officer, loss of any human life, really. If you go to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, you can go. They track every law enforcement death going all the way back to like the 1700s, the very first one. It's never been safer to be a law enforcement officer. There's about 800,000 law enforcement officers in America. And by the numbers in 2019, you had 135 lost in the line of duty. And by the way, that includes everything from just automobile crashes to, job-related illness was 70 of those. There was only 50 of the 135 were shot. None were stabbed. Like, if you can go look at the numbers over the from 2010 to 2019, 1,627 officers killed in the line of duty. 459 of those were job-related illnesses, Mike. Accidents, 335 were automobile crashes. 528 shot over that 10-year period. And there are people, and you know what the percentage that is? That's less than 0.5%, Mike. And there are people out here who, when we talk about COVID and we talk about the pandemic, despite the fact that 500,000 people died from this coronavirus over the last year, you know what they'll say? That's less than 1%, less than 2%. The survival rate is this, that, and the third. They will downplay that by those numbers. But if I were to point out these numbers, we'll have a different story. Oh, no. It's dangerous. They got to draw and shoot at just the mere thought or possibility. What other citizen gets to say, I think, I thought, I saw danger and kill people on the street? Often, in the majority of the time, no threat whatsoever. No gun present at the scene, no knife. A lot of people don't even know, Mike, less than half of all police officers have tasers. They don't even, we're still struggling to get body cams and tasers. We have to take a different approach of how we handle violence. Because the reality is, there are many heroes that have been cops over the years, but they're expected to take that risk. They're expected, within reason. I'm not asking them to just walk out there while people are shooting. But these are traffic stops over broken taillights, Mike, that they're killing people for. Minor incidents. And oftentimes they don't explain themselves. That needs to be a standard. Explain yourself. Walk up. I've pulled you over for this reason. I've stopped you for this reason. Sir, you are under arrest because blank. Half the time you get in these confrontations, you don't even know what the hell they're doing. They just start grabbing you, putting their hands on you, and out come cuffs. Excuse me, what's going on? Hello? Can you talk to me? Can you use your voice? Meanwhile, around the world, they're de-escalating as their number one option. They retreat if needed, get back up, because many of the officers, whether it's the UK, whether it's Japan, they don't have guns on them. They work to de-escalate. Every bouncer in every city has probably come face to face with a knife, and they're not armed, and they're able to de-escalate, and they're able to calm people down. Yet somehow we have law enforcement walking around with the full protection of the law, their badge, their body armor, terrified at every flinch when it's never been safer than ever before to be a police officer. When you walk out that door underneath the guise of being a hero, yet many of them are abusing the citizenry, abusing the law themselves while their coworkers look the other way. That's what has to change. The structure has to change. The tactics has to change. The accountability. There are states who are trying to pass laws for the past few years, Mike, to make it illegal to record the police. You know why? Because it's proving them wrong. The idea that you can't in public record the police to hold them accountable for their actions, and they're trying to hide. What do you have to hide if they're not doing anything wrong? That's what police will tell you when they come to ask you questions. Police are allowed to lie to you. You know how many people have been convicted by the lies of police officers? Just sign here and you'll go home. They're sending you right to jail. We have police officers, in order to increase their revenue, police departments, in order to increase their revenue, they hide in the bushes. They change the paint, they unmarked cars, ghost paint and holograms on the side of the car, so you can't even see or tell that that's a police officer there. You know why? Because they want to catch you going 1 mile over, so they can generate more and more revenue. We have unreasonable search and seizures. We have civil asset forfeiture, so they can get more money. They don't have enough money to get every officer a body cam and every officer a taser. But find me a law enforcement agency out here that don't have cars purchased within the last 5 years. Many police, especially out here in Texas, man, they have trucks. Those are way more expensive than just an Apollo or a police interceptor, Crown Vic. They have money for that. They have money to jail people, but they have no money to reform. They have no money to de-escalate. They can't train that. That's what has to change. And it will change eventually because the people will demand it. It's going, where the fight's not over. We have so much further to go, but we will not stop because they answer to the people. And we've got to make them answer to us. Peacefully, of course. But they are servants first. And we are the people who are to be served.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. They work for us. We pay police officers' salary. Remember that. We pay their salary. They work for us. Their salaries, their checks, their benefits are paid with our tax dollars. They are our servants, and that should not be misconstrued. Unfortunately, like you said, that policing, if it was a priority for them to do that, to stop the brutality, to stop the mistreating of certain individuals, they do it. A lot of it has to do with social economical issues. For instance, like you said, here in the northern suburbs of Dallas, you know, they don't even have cruisers. They have, everybody rides in a Tahoe SUV. They have the money. And because of that, you know, and because of the environment, they're a lot lax. Even my wife had gotten pulled over. I think she ran a yellow light or ran a red light or made a right, some minor traffic stop infraction. But, you know, the police pulled her over, just gave her a warning, said, hey, or, you know, this is a hot intersection for X, Y, and Z, took her on her way. You know, didn't have to go through the whole rigmarole of, you know, where are you going from? Where are you coming? Who's this? Who's that? Who's in, you know, whose car is this? You know, a lot of it has to do with social economical factors that unfortunately you find that there's less money where there's a majority of minorities that live, and you find that reflected in their policing. But we have to remember in all circumstances that that's not an excuse. You know, that's not an excuse whatsoever. Just because someone over here, you know, is making more money and, you know, that they deserve to be treated any better. We're all citizens of this country, and they're all servants of us. Every police officer, every law enforcement officer serves the citizen. It's not the other way around. So we want you guys to keep that in mind going forward. Be mindful in your interactions if you are a minority with the police, because I'd rather you get home safely, you know, than let your pride get in the way. Even though a lot of times they treat you unjustly. We've all been, you know, victimized by police, myself and Troy included. The old adage, I'd rather you get home alive than try to prove a point. That doesn't make it right. And we have to work and we have to find out ways to try to contribute to changing that narrative. That's the talk, as they say, we need to get to a point where we don't need to have that in minority communities. We need to get to a point where we don't have to tell our Black and brown kids that you have to do what you have to do to stay alive when you encounter police officers. Remember, they work for us. So do what you can to support any efforts for police reform. Be mindful of your interactions. A lot of people out there protesting. Be safe. We understand your frustration. We understand the pain and hurt that you have. But just be safe while you're out there. There's a lot of resources that show you things you can bring and things you can do to remain safe. And hopefully, as a country, we'll come to a awakening that we find a sensible manner to deal with this systemic issue. This is a pandemic. It's worse than COVID because it's been around for hundreds of years. This is a pandemic that we need to resolve. We need to find out a way to address the issues. We'll keep you guys posted as we see more stories and as we hear more things. We'll come and give you our thoughts about it. Our thoughts and prayers are with all those who've been victimized by police. Whether your story has been heard or unheard, we understand, we feel you. So we're prayerful for brighter days. Thank you for listening. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe and please share. And once again, thank you for listening to another episode of Upon Further Review.